It's really good. I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. Thank you for joining me at this event today, our Climate Bonds Connect 2022 conference. The theme of this conference is getting to $5 trillion a year by 2025. Why? Because we've got a bit of a challenge. We have a world in crisis. In crisis in the sense we're starting to feel the impacts of climate change, as you've seen over the last year, in a way that were not expecting before 2050. Things are moving fast. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, not as a stretch goal, but as a minimum requirement to have a 50% chance of a reasonable future for our children. These are not good odds, by the way. You know, if the trading desk was saying, well, if you do this by this, you'll get a 50% chance of getting good results on your trading desk, that's not a good story to be told. But nevertheless, that's what we've been told. So it's a minimum requirement. That requires capital. As we saw at the MAFS conference a couple of days ago, McKinsey's has shown we need $9.2 trillion a year shifted in mitigation. And that's before we get to resilience. You'll hear more about resilience a little later today. So this challenge, we've had some success, and the green bonds market, and it's the daughters of green bonds, the social, the resilience, the sustainability bonds that are all arisen from that theme, have proven that capital will move if we construct investments that meet their risk yield requirements and also address their long-term assets and liabilities managing problems. Because, of course, we're going to see wholesale portfolio decimation for GIC and Temasek and all the likes if we don't address climate change. We don't want to be investing in a world of the kind of volatility that's been predicted. This is a nasty place. So we've got to fix this problem. The green bond market is over $1 trillion. In fact, we're going to get ready to run rate of $1 trillion a year in the first half of next year. But we need to be having a run rate of $5 trillion a year to be having a real contribution. A big chunk of that's going to come from Asia. China is already the second largest and likely to be the largest green bond market in the world next year for a variety of reasons, including the government deciding to take drastic action. The 30-60 targets in China are real, and they're going to be met way ahead of time. And we'll hear Xi Jinping talking about that later this year at the Communist Party Congress. But of course, that's just one nation. We need all nations to be doing their bits. But as I said, doing their bits on addressing climate doesn't just mean cutting down your emissions. It also means improving your resilience. Singapore and the countries of ASEAN are highly exposed. We need to prepare, folks. We need to prepare for the increased severity of typhoons in the Philippines. Now, one of our staff here, a social media person, Mikey, tells me that he got enthused about working on climate change because he lived in a town that was demolished by a typhoon in Luzon years ago. That story is going to become much more common unless we can prepare. It is possible to prepare. The science is there. It does mean increasing the height of wharves in Singapore to ensure we can manage silt. Actually, that's being done. Singapore is ahead of the game. But it also means managing our water in a different kind of way. It means increasing the stormwater drains in Manila and Bangkok and Singapore, for example, simple things like that. It means preparing our societies. A just transition, a term you've probably heard about, doesn't just mean jobs for people who used to be coal workers. It also means jobs for people that are going to be negatively impacted by the climate change we have, which is going to be severe. How do we construct an economy and a society that stays wealthy in the context of the kind of shocks we're going to get every couple of years, so we can rebuild, or we can get up the next morning and get back to work and start building, continue to build the future for our children that we want to build. These are the challenges we face. $5 trillion a year in 2025 is a necessary goal. The purpose of today, from my perspective, is to explore this issue and give you a sense of how we're going to get there, and give you a sense of something else, which is the opportunity involved in doing this. Because this is going to mean a lot of investment. This is going to mean capital moving. capital markets will both make this happen and benefit from this. Opportunity is how we energise. We're not going to energise by saying it's going to be a disaster. We need to know the severity of the problem to understand what we've got to do, because we've got to make sure we don't mess up and do the things that aren't necessary, sure, but we also need to understand the opportunity. If McKinsey's right, and we invest $9.2 trillion a year just in the mitigation side, that is the biggest investment boom in history. Just think about that. Well, think about it during the course of the day. I would like to introduce, to kick off today's session, a video by Jane Fraser, the CEO of Citibank, who's our primary sponsor for this event. I'm hoping the team can invite Jane onto the screen. Yes?
Thank you, Sean, and on behalf of Citi, I'm delighted to join you in welcoming everyone to Climate Bonds Initiative Connect 2022. And this year's event comes at a defining moment, a year of intense weather, including summer heat waves and wildfires across the globe, has once again highlighted the urgency of the climate crisis. Yet, the war in Ukraine and its impacts on the global energy supply have further complicated the transition to a low-carbon economy. At Citi, our determination is as strong as ever. We believe that global financial institutions like ours have the opportunity and indeed the responsibility to play a leading role in confronting climate change. We have engaged in these efforts for many years, putting in place the foundations to help our clients achieve net zero. And today, there's an additional S in ESG, and that's security. And our efforts are helping corporates and communities build resiliency and sustainability in combating climate change. Earlier this year, we released our initial plan for achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Given the size and the breadth of Citi's portfolios and businesses, reaching net zero, it's a Herculean undertaking. What does it mean? It means rolling up our sleeves and working with our clients to embed the transition into every aspect of our work. The transition won't look the same for all of our clients, and that's why we're engaging client by client and sector by sector. Where the solutions are known, renewable energy, for example, we must facilitate scale and widespread adoption. And where solutions are less clear and more difficult to define, such as in agriculture or heavy industry and other high-emitting sectors, we must discover climate-friendly alternatives to business as usual, all with the goal of reaching cost parity as quickly as possible. The financial sector can help unleash the capital and put companies on the path to net zero, but strong government policy and technological advance are critical to driving change at scale. Thankfully, we have great partners such as Climate Bonds, which has been such a champion for public-private sector collaboration and which has consistently delivered cutting-edge solutions and provided clear, ambitious, science-based standards to support the transition. Confronting one of the biggest challenges of our time, it's not going to be easy, but out of collaboration and cooperation come hope and progress. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Jane. We have nearly 1,000 people online. This is a hybrid conference around the region, so we're a tiny minority of everyone online. You should have been given an invitation to the app. Please do use the app, because that's the way we're talking to each other across the community of people who are participating in this conference today. This is the first of 4 global conferences. It goes Singapore, London, Mexico City, New York, which means, by the way, you're free to join the other ones should you wish to participate in that time zone when the time comes. Look at our website for more details. Now I'd like to invite a very good friend, a pioneer in green finance, Harry Cho, to the stage to join me. I'm hoping this works. Yes, we're doing well. We're very privileged to be in this great hall from the Singapore Stock Exchange and to be able to introduce the Singapore Stock Exchange as a Climate Bonds partner. We hope to be working together on lots of things. We've already worked together on a couple of things. Harry can give some details. But I guess what I want to do today is have a conversation with Harry about what the challenges are, what you see as the things we need to do are, and so on. You've already heard me talk about the challenge we face, right? I won't go over more about that. You know that we've had some success in sustainable finance, and I got told earlier that of your fixed income listings on the stock exchange here, is it close to 20% now are green or sustainable in the fixed income, which is pretty cool. Tell me more about what's happening here.
Well, Sean, I wanted to ask you these questions first for you to set the global stage for us before we kick off the conference. So before we do, firstly, thank you and welcome everyone to Singapore Exchange Group and to the online audience as well. Very, very welcome. We're honored to be partnering with Climate Bonds Initiative, of course, and our good friend Sean Kidney, who truly is a pioneer with his team. And so welcome to Singapore, Sean. I think there are three key components that we can both discuss to kickstart off. What is the urgency that we're looking at? And with that urgency, what is the ambition that we're hoping to set? And thirdly, what can we collectively be hopeful about? Because we need that hope. You know, this is going to be a marathon. We're all here today because we're pioneers, we're leaders, and collectively we must work together on that. So Sean, on the urgency front, I'll give just a few pointers and I would love to hear you talk more. Well, 124 countries actually have committed to net zero, of which about 104 have pledged or committed to 2050 or sooner. Now, you can argue, of course, science-based perspective, we need to do more. But the progress is happening, and it is quite urgent. Now, here in Asia, we're lucky that Korea and Japan, for example, have set the scene already with 2050 net zero targets. Here in ASEAN, we've seen tremendous progress in the last year or two in terms of the pledges and ambition level going up. 8 out of 10 ASEAN countries have now set some level of net zero ambition that's more geared towards 2050. That is quite amazing for a region that has the significant percentage of the energy here to be coal-fired power plant, for example. Now, let's not underestimate the scale of change that we need to be undergoing. Same for China, same for India, same for major economies here in Asia. We've got Monetary Authority of Singapore's Ms. Gillian Tan here today, and she'll be sharing more. But with the Singapore government stepping up in their ambitions, they've currently, of course, they've already set a mid-century net zero goal, and there's an open consultation out right now for a net zero 2050 goal. And supplementing that also are some of the carbon tax pricing. It's going to be stepping up over time to $25 in 2024, 2025, to up to 80 and plus, and way beyond that by 2030. So all of this progress is happening, but the urgency comes in because if you look at the latest information, for example, from Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS, it shows that we're actually crystallizing what's called a disorderly transition, or possibly a hothouse world. Now, what is a disorderly transition? That means that, yes, there are climate change, there are policies that are being put in place. However, it's not coordinated to the extent that we need to see it, and or it's not happening fast enough, and it's possibly going to come more towards 2030, just before that, or after 2030. So what that means is we're going to see significant transition risk, and that's why it's going to be disorderly. But if you're, on the other hand, if you look at the current NDCs, we're actually crystallizing a hothouse world, i.e. the physical risk is going to be very, very significant, although the transition risk might be a bit less. So that is the urgent side, that we must collectively step up, not only the countries, but the private sector, and there's a lot of funding needing to be done.
I mean, it's difficult when you're in an economy that has invested a lot in things that we now discover after all these years create a harm to the environment. This is a challenge, and then turning the ship around is very tough. It's also difficult when, historically, we've got a climate justice framework. Emissions have come from the US and Europe, and more recently China. China now is twice the level of emissions production per annum as the US, let alone Japan. So this is all difficult, but unfortunately, no matter what the fairness of it, the numbers are what they are. We have to get emissions down very quickly around the world. So we're forced to act. And I have this regular conversation about, but hang on. The US has got to fix this act first. And let's say, while the Climate Act has just gone through in the US with some incredible subsidies for green technologies in there, the truth is for the last 5 years, they haven't been doing anything. And they've still got a lot of high emissions. So there are some fair criticisms, but we're the ones in this region that are going to suffer. And it's not going to help us to stamp our foot and say we're not doing anything until the US does it, and then we'll just cope with the typhoons, the civil rises, and so on. We kind of are forced to act anyway. But it's also true that we have to prepare on that last part, because now that we know that the world has been messed up, which we didn't realize as much, I mean, scientists did, but let's say the general body politic, until relatively recently, we've got to prepare. The resilience agenda is very important. We'll hear more from Lawrence Sorkin in the last session, talking about resilience, the importance part of it. But differentiated targets are problematic. So it's not true that we can keep building coal-fired power stations in Indonesia and say it's okay because the US was polluting 100 years ago. It's fair, but it's not correct in the terms of the science. And this is what we're in the middle of grappling with in the region. It is really tough to do this. But let's be clear, it's tough everywhere. The nature of what we've done globally, the emissions we've put in the atmosphere, and remember, we've put in more emissions of the atmosphere in the last 30 years than in the previous 150 years. So it's all continued to be getting worse while we've been having UN climate change conferences, unfortunately, means according to the IPCC, we now have to do a drastic reduction globally in emissions, as I said earlier, to have even a reasonable chance of having a reasonable life for our kids. And the consequences of not doing it are dire. So we're now in the middle of this big discussion, and I'm going to say the discussion in Asia is very focused on how do we transition. And that's the right discussion, right? How do we move our economy, our society from where it is now to where it needs to be, both in terms of addressing resilience and in contributing necessarily to the change. I always take the IEA net zero pathway as a good benchmark. When you put in all the sums of emissions reduction we have to get, it's just not possible to count any new fossil fuel investments as things that you can do as gets to the Paris Agreement. But they have factored in, absolutely correct, differentiated rollouts. So the Europe and the US have to close down their coal and gas-fired power stations earlier. That's like by 2035. And Asia and other countries have longer to go, but not enough time to build new ones. So all those new ones, the new coal-fired power stations in Indonesia, they're a problem. They're a problem for us. We've got to work on that, etc. So this is a taste of the extent to which we're in the throes of working out the nature of the ambition. We're trying to crystallize an understanding to make it easy for everyone. And this morning we ran a workshop here for potential public sector green bond issuers in Singapore, where we described the rule sets. It's not a matter of doing complicated carbon. It's a matter of looking at the MAS taxonomy, which is a guidance, a clarity, a simplicity of guidance about what qualifies in the context of these discussions, these complications. Now, we can't sort it all out at once. There's work that we're still doing. It's going to take time. We put out rule sets as quickly as possible to provide guidance, and that's happening in Europe and in China and Latin America as well, those kind of rule sets. So that's how we're trying to make it simple, and I'm hoping this is going to make it really simple for the people listing on your exchange as well.
Yeah, so why don't we combine the ambition and the hope together in rounding off our discussion, maybe, Sean? So ambition for this region, it's when you sit down and really try to think about the level of ambition that's needed is extraordinary. We're just getting our head around how to even move about on climate change mitigation alone. Yesterday and tonight as well, there's a 2 full day task force member annual get together. Unfortunately, I'm virtually contributing in London for Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure Task Force members, and there we're discussing how much nature and biodiversity is it really separate from climate change mitigation. We had Mr. Emmanuel Faber come, and actually the chair for ISSB come and do a closed-door, a 30-minute closed-door Chatham House rules sharing on the progress of where things are going with ISSB. And one direction is clear. When we think about climate, it really cannot be looked alone, and that's ever much so the case here in particular. Not only the nexus with nature and biodiversity, but also on the social side. So thinking through that, and what can Asia do to finance this in a way that is coherent, but also be setting managed pathways. And this is what something Ms. Yuki Asui, who's heading the GFAN's Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero for the APAC Hub here in Singapore for the region. That's one of the key things that she'll be talking about in the next. But we have to look at how do we support better and more of the green ambition that we already have and that we're already working on, combined with a managed phase out of certain assets, but also transition overall, whilst, and the picture will only get more complex, and this is where we need to simplify but not lose the details, whilst protecting and creating impact on the other environmental and social objectives as well. Now, just very quickly on the solutions and the hope part. I mean, the conference, I'm sure many of you probably were there on Tuesday at MAS's conference for Transition Zero and Blended Finance. One thing that's absolutely clear to us, I mean, this is a leading bond venue already, as you had briefly mentioned, Sean, just in the last 12 months. I mean, this is #1 venue, especially when it comes to international issuances by APAC issuers in G3 currencies. We've had more than $51 billion of more than 110 individual bond issuances in the last 12 months here, totaling about 110 billion or 225 issuances that's currently listed. But, what can we do to grow more of that? How can we support more projects and more companies actually tap into the capital? 2 examples. I can see that we have Bayfront COO Nicholas in the room as well, Mr. Nicholas Tan. It was also mentioned on Tuesday, but we must allow the institutional capital to tap in more, and that securitization of projects. We need to support the projects, and the securitization, that concept needs to proliferate more. #2, there were great discussions on blended finance and how to reduce risk capital for more companies of different sizes to come here. Now, of course, we've got the MAS grant scheme that we work together with MAS already to support up to 100,000 Sing dollars for upfront costs of issuance. But I also want to just highlight another partnership that we have with UK government's FCDO, which is the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office Mobilis program. So we've also got Thomas Fenn on here. Maybe you can just wave here to support. If there are any bond issuers who have any of your business, the issuances or your company itself as well, that's contributing to SDGs, and it is defined quite broadly, and you're going to be a bond issuer, there is technical assistance to, again, help defray some of your costs, right? So speak to Thomas as well. We need more of these programs. There's anchor investment that the program also gives for ECM, so the IPO candidates, etc. too. So we need to be growing more of this type of ecosystem to support.
Isn't the Singapore Stock Exchange lucky to have her? She's very good. To wrap up, there are three things we need to do. One is clarity. We do need to make it easy for people to understand what to do, because it's actually really complicated in parts. So guidance, look to the taxonomy, the MAS work in particular. That's one. Two is we then need to tilt our whole financial system towards green, towards sustainable, towards resilient. Now that includes blended finance, which is the key subject of the MAS conference 2 days ago. It includes regulatory measures to ensure that we invest in the right kind of water infrastructure and stop doing the bad infrastructure in Thailand, in Vietnam, and in Indonesia. There's a whole bunch of things. Tilt to green is the theme. But we also need to start imagining and creating the world that we need to have. That does mean clean, green cities. It does mean walking instead of getting in a car wherever you can. It does mean very energy efficient buildings have very energy efficiency air conditioning, which is not the case in Manila or Jakarta at this stage. It does mean agriculture that's resilient and can survive the changes that are starting to happen. There's so much. This is, if you like, a privilege of a moment to be in. It's an existential crisis for the human species. It's a bit uncertain how we're going to come out of this, but it's also a moment where we have to, we're forced to think about what kind of world we really want our kids to live in and make it happen. We have to make it happen, because if we don't make it happen, what I can tell you is it's going to be ugly. If we do make it happen, we can make it really cool, survive this crisis, and create wealth, because that's what happens when you invest $9.2 trillion a year in the right kind of fashion. The opportunity is unbelievable. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Huri, for all your work. And I'd like to now invite our next panel, Van Yuki first, onto the stage.